A world of palaces, empires, and global trade vanished almost overnight. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, a network of brilliant civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East came to a sudden, shocking end. This is the great mystery of the Bronze Age collapse. How could powerful, stable societies like the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, and even the mighty New Kingdom of Egypt all crumble so completely and so quickly? For centuries, the answer seemed lost to time, blamed on shadowy invaders or simple decay. But modern science has uncovered a new suspect, one that rewrites the story entirely. By the end of this investigation, you will understand how the very climate of the planet turned against these advanced societies, triggering a domino effect that erased an entire age. What force could possibly bring down multiple empires at once? And what does their forgotten fate tell us about the fragility of our own world? To grasp the scale of what was lost, we need to step back into that world at its peak. For several centuries before the collapse, the lands ringing the Eastern Mediterranean were not a collection of isolated kingdoms. They formed a remarkably integrated international system, a kind of ancient version of globalization. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the kings of the Hittites in Anatolia, from the merchants of Ugarit on the coast to the Mycenaean warlords in their hilltop palaces, these elites spoke a common diplomatic language, exchanged letters on clay tablets, and followed a shared set of rules for trade and politics. It was a club of great powers, and membership came with immense prosperity. The engine of this system was trade, but not the kind you might first picture. Yes, there were luxury goods flowing along well-established routes, gifts of gold, ivory, and finely crafted jewelry exchanged between royal courts to cement alliances. But the real backbone of this Bronze Age world was something far more fundamental: metal, specifically tin and copper, the two ingredients needed to make bronze. Copper mines were scattered in places like Cyprus, whose very name comes from the word for copper, but tin was incredibly rare. Major sources were thousands of miles apart, in places like modern-day Afghanistan and possibly as far as Cornwall in Britain. This meant that no single kingdom controlled all the resources needed for the technology that defined their age. The Hittites might have armies, and Egypt might have grain, but to equip soldiers with weapons and farmers with tools, everyone depended on a fragile, long-distance supply chain. Merchant ships laden with copper ingots and tin sailed a predictable circuit across the Mediterranean, while donkey caravans carried these vital goods overland. This interdependence created stability, a mutual interest in keeping the peace so that commerce and civilization itself could continue. This connectivity went beyond economics. It fostered a common high culture among the ruling classes. Egyptian pharaohs married Hittite and Babylonian princesses. Mycenaean Greek pottery styles have been found in the ruins of palaces on the Nile Delta. Scribes across different empires used the same cuneiform script to write in Akkadian, the lingua franca of diplomacy, much like English is used in international business today. They shared medical knowledge, architectural techniques, and religious ideas. It was a cosmopolitan age where an ambassador from a Mesopotamian city-state could feel relatively at home in a royal court in Greece or Anatolia, recognizing similar symbols of power, enjoying similar feasts, and discussing affairs of state through professional translators. This was not a dark or primitive time. It was a sophisticated international order, arguably the first of its kind in human history. They had built a world that worked, a complex and brilliant machine humming with activity. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so incomprehensible. How do you break a machine that everyone has a stake in keeping running? The answer lies not in the boardrooms of the palaces. but in the skies above them and the fields that fed them. Then, within the span of a single human lifetime, the machine broke. The world they knew did not slowly fade, it was systematically dismantled. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, a wave of calamity swept across this interconnected realm, and the archaeological record tells a story of fire and silence. It begins with the Hittite Empire, a formidable land power based in the highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Its capital, Hattusa, was a massive fortified city, a symbol of imperial might. And then it was simply gone. The city was burned so thoroughly that the heat vitrified stone and melted mud brick. The royal archives ceased, the line of great kings ended. The Hittite Empire, one of the two superpowers of the age, vanished from history, leaving only its abandoned ruins and a name that would be forgotten for over 3,000 years. Across the Aegean Sea, a similar story unfolded. The Mycenaean Greeks, builders of monumental palaces like Mycenae and Pylos, famous for the legends that would later become the Trojan War, saw their world implode. Their great administrative centers, the heartbeats of their complex society, were destroyed by fire and abandoned. The knowledge of their linear B script was lost. The intricate trade networks that supplied their workshops with materials collapsed. What remained were scattered villages, a simpler way of life, and a cultural amnesia so deep that later Greeks would look upon the massive stone walls of these ruins and call them the work of mythical giants, the Cyclopes, because they could not conceive that their own ancestors had built them. Along the vital coast of the Levant, the bustling mercantile cities that fueled the international economy were systematically erased. Ugarit, a wealthy port and critical hub for commerce and diplomacy, sent desperate final letters to neighboring kings pleading for help that never came. The city was sacked and burned, never to be rebuilt. A similar fate befell other important centers, their layers of ash marking a brutal end to centuries of urban life. Trade routes disintegrated, and the flow of essential goods, especially that all-important tin, ground to a halt. Only one of the great powers managed to survive, but at a terrible cost. New Kingdom Egypt, under the pharaohs Ramesses III and his predecessors, fought a series of desperate existential wars. Their temple walls at Medinet Habu record these conflicts against a coalition of invaders they called the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation that seemed to arrive from the sea and the shattered north. Egypt repelled them, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The treasury was exhausted, foreign holdings were lost, and the internal stability of the kingdom was shattered. The pharaohs who followed ruled a diminished, inward-looking state, a shadow of its former imperial glory. The totality is what staggers the imagination. This was not a regional conflict or a simple changing of the guard. This was a near-simultaneous failure across multiple, distinct, and geographically separate civilizations. Palaces, literacy, complex administration, international trade, monumental architecture, all these hallmarks of advanced society disappeared, not in one place, but almost everywhere within this interconnected system. It was as if a circuit breaker for an entire age had been tripped. What force could possibly apply such universal, simultaneous pressure? The answer, it turns out, was not a single invading army, but a failure of the very foundation upon which all these brilliant societies were built. The traditional story points to invaders, a shadowy confederation remembered only in Egyptian inscriptions as the Sea Peoples. These carvings show a chaotic mix of warriors in horned helmets and feathered headdresses, their ships clashing with Egyptian forces in a desperate naval battle. For a long time, historians saw this as the simple answer, a barbarian horde that swept through the civilized world like a storm, burning cities and toppling kingdoms. But this explanation, dramatic as it is, begins to unravel under closer scrutiny. Think about it, how could one group, no matter how fierce, simultaneously destroy empires as powerful and geographically distant as the Hittites in Anatolia and the Mycenaeans in Greece? The logistics alone make it nearly impossible. More importantly, the archaeological evidence does not show a uniform trail of destruction left by a single conquering force. Instead, it reveals a pattern of collapse that looks more like a system-wide failure. The Sea Peoples, then, appear less as a cause and more as a symptom, a terrifying effect of something far more profound going wrong. They were likely not a unified army but a desperate mix of displaced peoples, refugees, and opportunistic raiders, themselves fleeing from some unimaginable hardship. They were a sign that the entire regional order was coming apart at the seams. Warfare and migration in this context are almost never first causes. They are what happens when the foundation of society cracks. People do not abandon prosperous farms and bustling cities to become roving pirates without a powerful reason. So if the answer is not at the tip of a spear, where do we look? The search shifts from the battlefields to the fields that grow food, and to the skies that bring the rain. The clues to this foundational collapse were not written on any clay tablet or carved into any temple wall. They were hidden in places no ancient scribe would ever think to look, locked within the silent archives of the natural world. To solve this 3,000-year-old mystery, scientists had to become detectives of the deep past, learning to read a different kind of record. This field is called paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, and its tools allow us to open what is essentially the planet's own diary, written in ice, stone, and wood. Think of it like this: every year a tree grows, it adds a new ring. In a good, wet year, that ring is wide. In a year of drought or extreme cold, the ring is narrow, sometimes agonizingly thin. By studying the patterns of these rings in ancient, preserved wood, scientists using a method called dendrochronology can build a precise calendar of past climate conditions, stretching back thousands of years. They can pinpoint not just decades of hardship but individual bad years. But trees are not the only record keepers. At the bottom of quiet lakes and deep ocean floors, a slow, constant snowfall of tiny particles accumulates. Dust, pollen, and the microscopic shells of tiny creatures settle into layers, building up over centuries. By extracting long, tube-like cores of this sediment, researchers can read this layered history like the pages of a book. The types of pollen tell them what plants were thriving, which indicates rainfall patterns. The chemistry of those tiny shells reveals the temperature of the ancient water. And in the darkness of caves, another remarkable recorder slowly forms: stalagmites and stalactites. These speleothems grow from mineral-rich water dripping from the cave ceiling. Their growth layers, similar to tree rings, contain chemical signatures that act as a precise rain gauge, detailing the history of precipitation above the cave for millennia. By combining these different proxy records, from tree rings to sediment cores to cave formations, scientists can weave together a surprisingly detailed picture of what the weather was like in, say, the Eastern Mediterranean around the year 1200 before the Common Era. They are not just looking for a single bad storm, they are searching for a pattern, a climatic signal strong enough to shake the foundations of empires. What these natural archives began to reveal was not a simple change, but a violent, prolonged shock to the entire system, a period now known as the 3.2 Kiloyear event. And the story it told was one of drought, famine, and a world coming undone. The story of the collapse is written in the rings of ancient trees, deep in the highlands of Anatolia, the rugged heartland of the vanished Hittite Empire. Scientists discovered a remarkable archive, juniper trees that had lived and died over 3,000 years ago. Preserved in the dry climate, their trunks held a silent, precise chronicle of every growing season they had witnessed. By meticulously matching the patterns of wide and narrow rings from living trees to ancient logs, researchers built an unbroken year-by-year timeline stretching back to the Bronze Age. What they found was a climatic bombshell. Beginning right around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the tree rings tell a story of relentless, catastrophic drought. Not a single bad year or even a short dry spell, but a devastating period of aridity that stretched on for generation after generation. The rings became desperately narrow, a visual record of trees struggling to survive year after parched year. This was not a minor fluctuation, it was a fundamental shift in the region's climate, a mega-drought that gripped the land for decades. And the timing is impossible to ignore. It aligns perfectly with the sudden, fiery end of Hittite power. This discovery transforms our understanding of their fall. The Hittite Empire was an agricultural superpower, but one built on a precarious foundation. Their society, their massive army, their sprawling administration in the capital of Hattusa, all of it was fed by the grain harvests from the Anatolian plateau. Their entire political and economic system depended on predictable rainfall and bountiful yields. The dendrochronological record reveals the moment that predictability vanished. Imagine the slow, creeping terror of that drought. Season after season, the rains would fail, reservoirs and springs would dwindle, the soil would turn to dust. Crop yields would plummet, then fail entirely. For a kingdom that stored grain to feed its people and pay its soldiers, this was not just an economic problem, it was an existential threat. Famine would have spread through the countryside, driving desperate farmers into the cities in search of food that was no longer there. The authority of the central government, based on its ability to provide and protect, would have evaporated as quickly as the water in the wells. Social order would have frayed, then shattered. The great king in Hattusa could command armies, but he could not command the clouds. The meticulous tree ring data gives us the why behind the archaeological evidence of burned palaces and abandoned cities. The Hittite Empire did not simply meet a military defeat, it was starved and suffocated by a changing sky. Its collapse was not an invasion from the outside, but a collapse from within. Triggered by an environmental catastrophe they had no way to foresee or combat. This single climatic record from Anatolia provides a master key, showing us how a change in the weather could break the backbone of a civilization. But was this a localized disaster or part of a much larger pattern? The search for answers would soon lead scientists to another, even more unexpected source. The same story of drought was being written in stone and mud far from the Anatolian highlands. While tree rings recorded the struggle for survival in the heart of the Hittite world, other natural archives were capturing the broader climatic catastrophe. To understand the true scale of the disaster, scientists turned to the silent depths of the Dead Sea and the perpetual dark of ancient caves. What they found there confirmed that the crisis was not confined to one empire. It was a regional climate event reshaping the entire eastern Mediterranean stage. The Dead Sea, a terminal lake with no outlet, is an incredibly sensitive recorder of its environment. Every drop of water that flows into it carries a story. By drilling deep into the lakebed and extracting long, cylindrical cores of sediment, researchers can read that story layer by layer. These mud cores act like a 1,000-page book on past climate. During wet periods with more rainfall feeding the Jordan River, the lake level rises and the sediments that settle are fine and dark. During dry periods, the lake shrinks, the water becomes saltier, and the sediments that form are often lighter, with crystals of salt and gypsum. The cores from the Dead Sea covering the late Bronze Age tell a dramatic tale. They show a sudden, severe shift towards these arid conditions right at the time of the collapse. The evidence points to a rapid drop in the lake's level, indicating a profound and prolonged reduction in rainfall across the entire watershed that fed it. This was not a local dry spell, it was a regional aridification, a systematic drying out of the lands that were home to the Canaanite city-states. and which affected the agricultural lifelines of empires further afield. But perhaps the most precise rain gauge from this ancient world comes from underground. In caves across Israel and Greece, stalagmites have been growing from the cave floor for tens of thousands of years, fed by mineral-rich water dripping from the ceiling. Like tree rings, each growth layer in a stalagmite captures the chemical signature of the rainwater that seeped through the rock above. Scientists can analyze the ratio of different oxygen isotopes in these layers, a measurement that acts as a highly accurate proxy for past rainfall amounts. The speleothem records from caves such as Sorek Cave in Israel deliver a stunningly clear message. They chart a major, multi-decade shift towards drier conditions beginning around 1200 before the Common Era. The graph of this data does not show a gentle decline, it shows a cliff, a sharp drop in precipitation that persisted. This same arid signal appears in stalagmites from caves in northern Greece, far from the Levant, indicating the drought's wide reach. Think of what this means on a human scale. From the olive groves of Greece to the wheat fields of Anatolia to the river-fed gardens of the Levant, the rains became less reliable, then failed. Springs and wells that communities had depended on for generations ran dry. The shared environmental crisis was now undeniable. This was not a series of unrelated local droughts. It was a synchronized climatic downturn affecting the core territories of nearly every major Bronze Age power at the same time. The very geography that had once fostered connection through trade now became a conductor for shared disaster. A kingdom might withstand a military invasion or recover from a poor harvest, but no civilization of that era had the reserves or the technology to withstand a coordinated, decades-long assault on its most basic resource, water. The stage was now set for a domino effect of unimaginable proportions. Even the mighty Nile, the timeless source of Egypt's strength, faltered under this new climatic regime. For millennia, the rhythm of Egyptian civilization was set by the river's annual flood, a predictable surge of water and fertile silt that turned the desert valley into a breadbasket. This natural cycle was so dependable that it formed the bedrock of pharaonic power and cultural identity. Egypt was often seen as an island of stability, insulated from the troubles of its neighbors by its great river. But the paleoclimate records reveal a terrifying truth. During the crucial decades of the late 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era, that reliability broke down. Scientists studying sediment cores from the Nile Delta have uncovered evidence of a prolonged period of consistently low floods. The layers of silt and organic material tell a story not of a single bad year, but of a systemic failure in the river's life-giving pulse. Year after year, the floodwaters did not rise high enough to irrigate all the fields or deposit their vital layer of nutrients. This was a slow-motion disaster for a society built on agricultural surplus. You can almost hear the silence that must have followed the annual measurement of the Nilometer, the device used to gauge the flood's height, as priests and officials watched the water level stop far short of the mark needed for prosperity. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Crop yields plummeted. Grain reserves, the kingdom's strategic buffer against hardship, began to empty. Famine, a word that rarely appears in the proud inscriptions of pharaohs, became a grim reality for the people of the two lands. Tomb paintings from the era shift from scenes of bountiful harvests to stark depictions of emaciated figures, a silent artistic testimony to widespread hunger. This internal crisis of food and faith fundamentally weakened the Egyptian state just as external pressures reached their peak. A government struggling to feed its own population cannot effectively marshal resources for distant wars or secure its frontiers. The pharaoh's divine mandate to maintain Mat, the cosmic order of truth and balance, was visibly crumbling as the very river that embodied that order failed. The desperate wars against the sea peoples, so gloriously depicted on the walls of Medinet Habu, were fought by a kingdom already bleeding from within. Egypt survived the collapse, but it was a hollow victory. The treasury was exhausted, its empire in Canaan was lost, and the internal social contract between the people and the pharaoh was fractured. The new kingdom gave way to a period of division and diminished power. Egypt's story shows that even the most resilient civilization is not immune to a changing climate. It merely determines the form the collapse will take. While others vanished entirely, Egypt was reduced, its golden age brought to an end not by a superior army, but by a starving river and the silent, global forces that had choked it. So we have the evidence, a perfect storm of drought recorded in tree rings, lake beds, and cave stones. But how does a change in the weather erase a civilization? The answer lies in understanding these societies not as collections of cities, but as intricate, interconnected systems. Modern historians use a powerful framework to explain the Bronze Age collapse, called the Systems Collapse Model. It shows how a single primary shock, like a decades-long drought, can trigger a cascade of failures where each broken piece puts more strain on the next until the entire structure comes down. Think of it like a row of dominoes. The first domino to fall is the climate. A prolonged drought is not merely a bad harvest, it is a direct attack on the foundation of a Bronze Age state. Agriculture collapses, fields that once fed cities and armies turn to dust. Grain reserves in palace storehouses, which might last a year or two, are slowly emptied as the dry years drag on. This is the second domino, famine. Widespread hunger does more than cause suffering, it shatters the social contract. The central authority, whether a king or a palace bureaucracy, derives its power from its ability to provide security and distribute food. When it can no longer do that, its legitimacy evaporates, people lose faith. This internal strain leads to the third domino, social unrest and rebellion. Desperate, hungry populations may turn against their own ruling classes. Provincial governors may withhold taxes or grain shipments, seeking to save their own regions. The cohesion of the kingdom fractures from within. Now remember that brilliant international system of trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age world. It depended entirely on stability and surplus. A kingdom needs surplus grain to feed the specialized craftsmen who make goods for trade. It needs security to protect the merchant caravans and ships moving along those long routes. As internal order breaks down, that system seizes up. This is the fourth domino, the collapse of long-distance trade. The copper and tin shipments from thousands of miles away stop coming. Without bronze, you cannot make new weapons for your soldiers or new tools for the few farmers still trying to work the land. The technological base of the society itself begins to decay. This combination of famine, internal rebellion, and the loss of critical imports creates a wave of desperate people with nothing left to lose. Some band together as raiders, looking to take by force what the land can no longer provide. Others are simply displaced, whole communities picking up and moving in search of food and safety. This is the fifth domino, mass migration and warfare. These are the groups that history would later label the Sea Peoples, not a unified army but a storm of human desperation spilling out from the collapsed interior of Anatolia and the Aegean, washing up against the shores of those who were still barely holding on, like Egypt. From this perspective, the fiery destruction of cities is not the cause of the collapse, but its final, violent symptom. A city like Ugarit or Hattusa was not destroyed by an external enemy alone. It was likely already dying from the inside, weakened by hunger and strife, its defenses manned by malnourished soldiers, its gates perhaps even opened by disaffected citizens. The system's collapse model reveals the true tragedy. These civilizations were not conquered by a superior force, they unraveled. A climatic shock exposed the hidden vulnerabilities in their complex, interdependent world, and one by one the dominoes fell. But this story of interconnectedness holds one last, profound question. If their world was so linked that a crisis could spread like a virus, could the opposite also be true? Could a memory of their collapse have traveled across the centuries, hidden within the very myths we still tell today? The collapse of that international system was not a side effect. It was the central mechanism of the downfall. Think of those Bronze Age palaces not just as political capitals, but as the headquarters of vast state-run corporations. Their wealth, their power, even their ability to project military force, was entirely dependent on the smooth operation of a supply chain that stretched across the known world. When the climate shock hit, this intricate network was the first thing to shatter, and its failure guaranteed that no single kingdom could recover. The most critical link in that chain was the one that seemed the most secure: the trade in tin. Remember, bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively available from places like Cyprus, but tin was the miracle ingredient, the rare element that transformed soft copper into a metal hard enough for swords, armor, and tools. Major tin sources were thousands of miles from the centers of power in distant lands like Afghanistan. Its journey to a Mycenaean armory or a Hittite forge was a marvel of logistics, passing through countless middlemen, traveling on ships and donkey caravans over many months. This system worked beautifully in a world of stability and surplus, but introduce a decades-long drought, and every single link in that chain rusts and breaks. First, scarcity. As famine gripped the interior regions, the overland caravan routes became impossibly dangerous. Local communities, themselves starving, would be less likely to provide safe passage or supplies to foreign merchants. The cost of moving goods skyrocketed as risk increased. A single ingot of tin, by the time it finally arrived at a port or a palace, would have become astronomically expensive, a luxury item rather than an industrial commodity. For a palace economy that needed to equip an army of thousands, this was an impossible burden. Second, the maritime routes disintegrated. The same drought that emptied grain silos also created a new, desperate demographic: climate refugees with nothing left to lose. Coastal settlements that could no longer farm turned to raiding. The eastern Mediterranean, once a predictable highway for merchant galleys, became a treacherous frontier plagued by piracy. These were the early sea peoples, not a unified navy but a swarm of opportunistic raiders preying on the weakened trade lanes. A merchant ship laden with valuable copper and tin ingots was now a floating treasure chest, a prime target. Ensuring such a voyage, both in terms of cost and risk, soon became untenable. The ships simply stopped sailing. And third, the loss of partner states. Trade is a relationship. You cannot buy tin from a merchant whose home city has been burned and abandoned. As key commercial hubs like Ugarit and coastal towns across Cyprus and the Levant fell, either to internal collapse or external attack, the entire directory of business contacts evaporated. A Mycenaean king could no longer send a letter to a trading partner in Syria to order a shipment, because that partner, his city, and his entire commercial infrastructure were gone. Palace economies were thus hit with a perfect storm. They could no longer afford the critical materials they needed. They could no longer safely transport them if they were found, and the trusted partners who supplied them were no longer there. The result was a rapid, irreversible deindustrialization. Without a reliable bronze supply, armies could not be rearmed, tools could not be replaced, and the technological advantage that maintained elite power simply faded away. The palace, as an economic engine, seized up and died. Its stored wealth of gold and jewelry became meaningless in a world where you could not trade it for the metal needed to defend your walls. This was the domino effect in its most devastating form, a climate-driven crisis that severed the connections holding the age together, leaving each civilization isolated, impoverished, and vulnerable in its final hours. The palace was not just a royal residence, it was the central processor for the entire economy. In the Mycenaean world of Greece and the Hittite highlands of Anatolia, this system, known to scholars as the palatial or redistributive economy, functioned with remarkable efficiency. Everything flowed through the palace's storerooms. Farmers would deliver their grain, olive oil, and wool as a form of tax. Skilled artisans, from potters to bronze smiths to weavers, received rations of these raw materials from the palace to craft goods. Soldiers and administrators were paid in food and supplies from the same central reserve. The palace acted as the heart, lungs, and brain of the civilization, collecting, allocating, and recording every vital transaction. This system created stability and allowed for grand projects, but it had one catastrophic weakness. Its entire legitimacy depended on a single, uninterrupted input: a successful harvest. When the decades-long drought took hold, that vital input failed. Fields produced less than nothing. The farmers, who were the primary taxpayers, had no surplus grain to bring to the palace gates. The central storerooms, which might have held a year or two of buffer, began to empty and were not refilled. This was more than an economic recession. It was a systemic cardiac arrest. The palace could no longer feed the artisans, so pottery workshops and metal foundries fell silent. It could no longer pay the soldiers, so the armies that defended the kingdom and enforced the king's will simply dissolved. It could no longer support the scribes, the accountants of the state, who meticulously tracked every jar of oil and every piece of bronze on clay tablets. The abandonment of the Linear B script by the Mycenaeans is one of the most telling archaeological clues. This was not a gradual forgetting of a difficult language. It was the sudden, complete irrelevance of an entire administrative technology. When there was nothing left to count, when the flow of goods through the palace stopped completely, the scribes laid down their stelae for the last time. Their detailed records of chariot wheels, textile workers, and religious offerings became obsolete. Literacy itself, in that complex form, was a luxury the collapsing system could no longer afford. The same story unfolded in Hattusa. The vast clay tablet archives of the Hittite kings, containing treaties, laws, and correspondence, end abruptly. The last known texts are not proclamations of glory, but desperate pleas for grain shipments from allies who had none to give. As the palace's ability to redistribute vanished, so did the reason for anyone to obey its commands. Why would a starving farmer in a distant valley continue to send his last handful of grain to a capital that could offer nothing in return? Why would a local governor, responsible for his own community's survival, forward taxes to a central authority that could no longer provide protection or relief? The social contract, enforced for generations, was broken by hunger. Power devolved instantly from the palace to the local village, from the king to whoever could secure the next meal. The grand administrative state, with its scribes, its tax collectors, and its specialized workshops, did not just shrink, it atomized. People abandoned the capital cities not merely because they were attacked, but because they were empty shells, centers of a bureaucracy that no longer functioned. They walked away from the palaces because the palaces had nothing left to give, turning their backs on complexity and heading toward a simpler, harder, but perhaps more survivable life. This internal unraveling made the final destruction almost a formality. A city whose heart has already stopped is merely a body waiting to fall. These displaced peoples became the storm that broke upon the shores of the surviving world. For generations, the term Sea Peoples has conjured images of a mysterious, coordinated naval invasion, a barbarian horde descending from the sea to topple civilizations. But the climatic evidence forces us to see them differently. They were not the cause of the collapse, they were its human consequence. Picture not a unified army, but a mosaic of desperation. These were communities from the parched highlands of Anatolia, from the failing fields of the Aegean Islands, from the crumbling city-states of the Levantine coast. Their homelands could no longer sustain them. Years of crop failure and the breakdown of social order left them with a stark choice: stay and face an uncertain fate, or move. And so they moved in family groups, in bands of warriors, in whole villages pulling up roots. They traveled by land with their carts and animals, and they traveled by sea in whatever vessels they could muster, not as a coordinated fleet but as a flotilla of refugees. Their movement was not a campaign of conquest, it was a search for survival, a blind, hungry push toward regions rumored to still have food and stability. This is the critical reframing. The Sea Peoples were a climate-driven exodus. They became raiders because they were starving, and the only places left with stores of grain were the fortified cities and states that still stood. When these displaced groups encountered the weakened but still functioning kingdoms on the periphery, like Egypt or the mercantile city of Ugarit, the result was catastrophic. Ugarit's final, panicked letters found in its burned ruins are a window into this dynamic. The city's king wrote to the ruler of Alashiya, modern-day Cyprus, saying, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." He pleads for help, but the reply is devastating. It says, "As for what you have written to me, the enemy is advancing against me. What can I send you?" The very allies who might have helped were themselves under the same wave of pressure. The defensive networks had collapsed because every node in the system was failing simultaneously. Egypt, under Pharaoh Ramesses III, faced this onslaught at its delta. The famous reliefs at Medinet Habu show a chaotic naval battle, with Egyptian forces fighting warriors in distinctive headgear. The pharaoh's inscriptions claim a great victory, calling the attackers nations from the sea, but read between the lines of this propaganda, and you see the true nature of the threat. The records list a bewildering array of names: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh. These were not a single nation, but a coalition of the displaced, a temporary alliance of disparate groups forged by shared desperation. Egypt survived by marshalling its last reserves of strength and using its geographic advantage, the Nile Delta's narrow channels, to funnel these seaborne groups into a decisive battle. But survival came at a staggering cost. The victory drained the kingdom's resources and marked the end of its imperial ambitions. The Peleset, one of these groups, were eventually settled by the Egyptians along the southern coast of Canaan, where they would become known to history by a different name, the Philistines. This settlement itself is a clue. It suggests that after the immediate crisis passed, these sea peoples were not mythical destroyers, but people in need of land and a new beginning. The climatic model thus solves the mystery of their origin. They did not emerge from a historical vacuum. They were the farmers, herders, and sailors of the very civilizations that were collapsing, set adrift by a changing climate and set in motion against their neighbors. Their violence was not the spark that started the fire. It was the wind that spread the flames from one dying kingdom to the next, until the entire landscape of the Bronze Age world was left in ashes and silence. The Hittite Empire's story is the clearest example of how a climate shock can dismantle a superpower from the inside out. To understand their fall, we need to look at their geography not as a map of conquest, but as a map of vulnerability. Their heartland was the high, dry Anatolian plateau, a land of harsh winters and a short growing season. While they controlled vast territories, their core population and their massive army were fed by grain harvests from this specific, climatically sensitive region. The empire was like a powerful engine, but it ran on a very specific, locally sourced fuel. The tree ring data from Anatolian junipers reveals the moment that fuel supply was cut off. Starting around 1200 before the Common Era, those rings narrow into a chronicle of thirst, marking the beginning of a mega-drought that would last for generations. For the Hittite farmer, this meant successive years of failed crops. For the royal administration in the capital, Hattusa, it meant the palace granaries, the state's primary strategic reserve, were slowly emptying and could not be refilled. Famine began to creep from the countryside toward the centers of power. This internal crisis was compounded by a second, critical vulnerability: their complete dependence on long-distance trade. The Hittites were masters of land warfare, but their realm lacked accessible tin mines. The bronze for their chariots, their weapons, their tools, all of it depended on tin imports traveling thousands of miles from sources like Afghanistan, through a fragile network of allies and merchants. As the drought gripped the wider region, that network disintegrated. Overland caravan routes became too dangerous, picked clean by bandits and starving communities. Maritime trade collapsed under the pressure of seaborne raiders, the early sea peoples, who were themselves victims of the same climatic disaster. Even if Hattusa had gold to pay, the tin simply stopped arriving. The empire faced a paralyzing double bind. It could not feed its people, and it could not re-arm its soldiers. The social and political consequences were immediate and devastating. The authority of the great king in Hattusa was based on a sacred contract. He provided protection and justice in return for loyalty and grain. As he could no longer provide food, that contract was broken. Outlying provinces, also struggling with hunger, stopped sending their taxes to a capital that offered nothing in return. Local governors likely hoarded what little grain they had for their own communities. The empire began to fragment, not from a foreign invasion, but from a loss of faith. Hattusa, a magnificent fortified city built for prestige and ceremony, became a liability. It was a massive concentration of hungry mouths with no productive farmland of its own. The final abandonment of the capital was not a sudden flight from an attacking army, though attack may have come later. It was a logical, grim decision. The population, including the royal court itself, likely simply walked away, dispersing into smaller, more sustainable communities in search of food and a way to survive. The great archives fell silent. The last known Hittite texts are heartbreaking requests for emergency grain shipments from Egypt, a plea from one crumbling power to another. When archaeologists eventually uncovered Hattusa, they found a city methodically abandoned, its gates left open, its treasures gone. There was no grand last stand, just a quiet, final admission that the system had failed. The Hittite Empire did not fall to a more powerful enemy. It was starved and suffocated by a changing world, its complex structure rendered useless when the climate withdrew its most basic support. The same climatic signature that dried up Anatolia also parched the hills of Greece. Speleothem records from caves in the north of the country tell a parallel story, a sharp turn towards arid conditions that began just as the Mycenaean world reached its peak. In the rugged, mountainous landscape of Greece, this shift was not merely an inconvenience, it was a direct assault on the very possibility of life. Mycenaean agriculture was a delicate balancing act, relying on small, fertile plains nestled between rocky slopes and a fragile network of springs and seasonal streams. When the rains diminished year after year, those plains turned to dust, and the streams ran dry long before the harvest. The result was a relentless agricultural stress that the palace system, for all its complexity, was utterly unequipped to handle. We see the Mycenaean response written in stone, not in their administrative tablets, but in their fortifications. As the drought deepened, a fascinating and tragic pattern emerged across their kingdoms. The great citadels, like Mycenae itself with its famous Lion Gate, and Turin's with its colossal cyclopean walls, were not abandoned. Instead, they were feverishly strengthened. New walls were built, older ones were thickened, and secret underground passages were dug to secure access to water sources that were vanishing above ground. This was a society turning inward, adopting a fortress mentality. The ruling elite were concentrating their dwindling resources and whatever food remained behind these monumental walls, pulling back from the open countryside and its starving villages. It was a strategy of last resort, a desperate attempt to preserve the core of power by sacrificing the periphery. But a fortress cannot survive if the land that feeds it is dead. The massive walls speak of a leadership that understood the threat was existential, yet could only conceive of a military solution to an ecological crisis. They were preparing for a siege, but the enemy was not an army at the gates. It was the silent, creeping drought that was already inside, withering the fields that supplied the grain stores within those very walls. The archaeological record shows that this defensive posture ultimately failed. Layer after layer of destruction by fire marks the end of the major palaces. The grand Megaran halls, centers of administration and ceremony, were reduced to ash and collapsed rubble. This was not a uniform conquest. It was the violent unraveling of a society already broken by hunger. Some fires may have been set by external raiders, others perhaps by internal rebellion from those locked outside the citadel gates. The aftermath was a profound silence. The population of Greece plummeted, with estimates suggesting a decline of up to 90% in some areas. People dispersed from the decimated centers, retreating to isolated, subsistence-level villages. The intricate knowledge of the Linear B script, used solely for palace accounting, vanished completely. When there was no longer a palace to keep records for, when the flow of goods it tracked had ceased, literacy became a useless artifact. The Greek world entered a period later historians would call the Dark Ages, not because people became ignorant, but because the complex system that supported specialized crafts, long-distance trade, and written communication had been erased. The Mycenaeans did not fall to a more advanced culture. They were defeated by a changing climate that their fortress walls, however mighty, could not keep out. Their story is a stark lesson in how the most formidable defenses are meaningless when the foundation of society, the land itself, turns against you. The Nile, though diminished, never completely failed. This simple geographic fact is the key to Egypt's survival when every other great power fell. While the Hittites and Mycenaeans starved under a failing sky, dependent on unpredictable rainfall, Egypt's lifeline was the river itself. The paleoclimate records show the annual flood was consistently low for decades, a disaster that caused famine and social strain, yet a low Nile is still a Nile. Its course remained fixed, its valley still fertile compared to the deserts surrounding it. This provided a crucial margin of error that rain-fed civilizations simply did not have. Their drought was absolute, a complete withdrawal of the resource they depended on. Egypt's crisis was one of degree, a terrible shortage but not a total absence. The river's predictability, even in failure, meant the agricultural system, though crippled, was not utterly obliterated. People knew where the water would be, even if there was less of it. This allowed for a painful contraction rather than a total collapse. Political cohesion under a strong, centralized ruler provided the second pillar of survival. As the storm gathered, Egypt was led by Pharaoh Ramesses III, a ruler from a line of powerful monarchs who still commanded the apparatus of the state. When the wave of displaced peoples, the Sea Peoples, approached the delta, Ramesses could do what the kings of Hattusa or Mycenae could not. He could still marshal resources. He drew upon the last reserves of grain and wealth to fortify the Nile's branches and muster a fleet. The famous battle, commemorated on his mortuary temple walls, was a desperate all-or-nothing defense. He funneled the seaborne attackers into the confined channels of the delta, where his still organized forces could meet them. This victory was a testament to what a functioning state, even a wounded one, could achieve when it retained control of its core territory and its people's loyalty. The pharaoh was still seen as the guarantor of Maat, the cosmic order, and in a time of chaos, that symbolic power held immense sway. But to call this a triumph would be a profound misunderstanding. Egypt survived, but it was forever changed. The cost of victory bled the kingdom dry. The treasury was exhausted, the grain stores emptied. The empire in Canaan and Syria, which had supplied additional wealth and strategic depth, was lost and never reclaimed. In the decades that followed Ramesses III, the central authority unraveled. The new kingdom gave way to a period of division, with rival power bases in the north and south. The priesthood of Ammon gained unprecedented economic and political power, effectively ruling Upper Egypt from Thebes. The age of the great warrior pharaohs building monuments to imperial glory was over. Egypt retreated in on itself, becoming a diminished, inward-looking power focused on its own preservation. It entered what scholars call the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and reduced international influence. So while the Nile's geography and a moment of strong leadership saved it from the oblivion that consumed its peers, Egypt did not escape the collapse. It merely experienced it in slow motion, emerging on the other side as a shadow of its former self, a living lesson that in a systemic collapse there are no true victors, only degrees of survival. The world that emerged from the ashes was unrecognizable. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a profound silence descended, not just of voices, but of ambition, of connection, of scale. This was not a brief interruption, it was a civilizational reset, a period historians aptly call the Greek Dark Ages and a wider Near Eastern Dark Age. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of absence, where bustling ports and palatial citadels once stood, now lay empty ruins slowly being reclaimed by earth and weeds. The population collapsed, with estimates suggesting a staggering drop of perhaps 90% in regions like Greece. It was not necessarily a single catastrophic event, but a slow, grinding attrition from famine, from the hardships of displacement, and from the disintegration of the social structures that had once supported large, concentrated communities. The survivors did not rebuild the palaces, they dispersed. The great political units, the empires and kingdoms, shattered into countless fragments. People gathered in small, isolated villages, often far from the coast for safety, living a life focused purely on subsistence. The grand international stage vanished, replaced by countless local horizons. You could live your entire life in one of these valleys and never meet a trader from another land, never hear news from beyond the nearest mountain range. The world had become vast and empty again. With this retreat came a catastrophic loss of knowledge, a kind of societal amnesia. The advanced technologies that had defined the Bronze Age were not merely paused, they were forgotten. The engineering skill required to build cyclopean walls or vast columned halls faded away. The intricate art of fresco painting, depicting processions and ceremonies, was lost. Most profoundly, the very ability to write in the complex syllabic scripts of linear B or cuneiform disappeared from daily life. In Greece, literacy vanished entirely for centuries. These were not practical skills for a village struggling to feed itself. Writing had been the tool of administrators and priests, of palace accountants tracking shipments of wool and oil. When the palaces fell, the need for those records evaporated. The scribe laid down his stylus, and his son never learned to pick it up. This loss severed the present from the past in a way we can barely comprehend. The Mycenaeans became a mystery to their own descendants, their massive ruins attributed to giants from a forgotten age. This period, therefore, is far more than a blank page in a history book. It represents a deep unraveling of human complexity. The interconnected, specialized, hierarchical world of the Bronze Age was replaced by a simpler, localized, and more self-sufficient existence. It was a hard reset, a return to fundamentals after the grand experiment of international civilization had catastrophically failed. Yet, within this silence, the seeds of a very different future were quietly taking root. Yet this story of universal collapse holds a fascinating contradiction. While empires burned and kingdoms fell into silence, not every light went out. In the very same centuries that witnessed the end of the Hittites and Mycenaeans, other regions not only survived but in some ways thrived. This is a crucial complication, one that prevents us from seeing the climate crisis as a simple, all-consuming wave of destruction. It was a storm, but its impact depended heavily on local geography and the shape of the society it struck. Look east to the great river valleys of Mesopotamia. Here, the mighty Assyrian state, centered on the Tigris River, did not collapse. It entered a period often called a dark age in its historical records, a time of reduced royal power and fewer monumental inscriptions, but its core cities were not abandoned. The Assyrian heartland persisted. Further west along the narrow coastal strip of the Levant, the great merchant cities of the Phoenicians, places like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, show remarkable continuity. Their layers of destruction are absent or minimal. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests that in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, these cities began to lay the groundwork for the Phoenician maritime expansion that would define the next age. How did they weather the storm when their neighbors were swept away? The answer lies in a combination of environmental luck and economic adaptability. For Assyria, the key was the Tigris. Unlike the rain-fed agriculture of Anatolia or Greece, Assyrian farms were irrigated by the river's waters through a network of canals. While a mega-drought would certainly have reduced the flow of the Tigris and caused hardship, a river-based irrigation system offered a buffer that simple rainfall agriculture did not. The water was still there, even if it was lower. Farmers could still channel it to their fields, providing a more reliable, though diminished, harvest. This technological adaptation to a dry environment, built up over millennia, provided a critical layer of resilience. For the Phoenician cities, their salvation was the sea and their economic model. Nestled between the mountains and the Mediterranean, these were not vast territorial empires dependent on inland grain belts. They were compact, fortified ports whose wealth came from commerce, craft, and their famed cedar timber from the nearby mountains. When the overland trade routes through the collapsing interior shattered, the Phoenicians simply pivoted. Their livelihood was not tied to a single, fragile supply line for tin or a vast agricultural hinterland. They were masters of the sea lanes. As chaos engulfed the palaces, these skilled mariners may have initially faced piracy, but they also found opportunity. With the great powers gone, there was a vacuum. They could establish new direct trade connections, bypassing the old imperial middlemen. Their economy was inherently flexible, built on networks rather than territorial control. Furthermore, their coastal location likely provided a different microclimate, perhaps with more reliable rainfall or access to freshwater springs from the mountain aquifers, offering some protection from the worst of the inland drought. The survival of these regions forces us to refine the narrative. The 3.2 Kiloyear event was not a universal off-switch for civilization. It was a severe, prolonged stress test. Societies that were overly centralized, dependent on a single type of agriculture, and locked into complex, long-distance dependencies for critical resources, like the Hittites and Mycenaeans, failed that test catastrophically. Societies that had built-in buffers like river irrigation or whose economies were decentralized, flexible, and maritime-based like the Phoenicians found ways to endure and even adapt. This nuance is vital. It shows that climate change is never a solitary actor. It is a catalyst that interacts with the specific vulnerabilities and strengths of a society. The same drought that starved an empire could be a period of hardship and reorganization for a resilient city-state. The collapse, therefore, was not an inevitable fate written in the weather, but the result of a deadly intersection between a changing climate and a particular kind of fragile, interconnected world. Another compelling suspect in this ancient mystery has long been a violent explosion from the Earth itself. The cataclysmic eruption of the Thera volcano on the island now known as Santorini was one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history. It occurred around the year 1600 before the Common Era, and its impact was unquestionably devastating. The blast would have been heard across continents, its ash plume darkening skies for weeks, and the tsunamis it generated would have crashed with terrifying force onto the shores of Crete, severely weakening the Minoan civilization that thrived there. For many years, this event seemed like a perfect culprit for the wider Bronze Age collapse, a single, spectacular disaster that could have shattered the delicate networks of the age. It is a dramatic and satisfying narrative, a geological deus ex machina that explains a complex historical change with a single, earth-shattering bang. But there is a critical problem with this theory, a problem of time. The Thera eruption happened approximately 400 years before the collapse of the Hittite and Mycenaean worlds. In archaeological terms, that is an enormous gap, equivalent to the time between the height of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. While Thera certainly caused a major regional crisis for the Minoans and their neighbors in the mid-2nd millennium, the palace systems of the late Bronze Age not only survived that event, they flourished afterward. The Mycenaeans, in fact, reached their peak of power and expansion in the centuries following Thera's eruption. This chronological misalignment is why most scholars now see Thera as a prelude, a separate tragedy that reshaped the earlier part of the Bronze Age, but not the final blow that ended it. The search for the cause of the collapse requires a trigger that aligns precisely with the archaeological horizon of destruction around 1200 before the Common Era, not 4 centuries earlier. This distinction is not just academic nitpicking, it highlights a fundamental principle in solving ancient mysteries. We must match the cause with the effect in time, and the effect we are trying to explain is the simultaneous failure of multiple, resilient societies in the 12th century. A single, sudden catastrophe like a volcano, while immensely destructive, tends to have a more localized and immediate impact. It creates a clear before and after, but it does not typically explain a slow-moving, decades-long unraveling across an entire region. The collapse we see in the archaeological record is not a single layer of ash covering every city at once. It is a staggered pattern of abandonment, fire, and social fragmentation playing out over generations. This is precisely what makes the climatic evidence so compelling. It provides a cause that operates on the correct timescale, a prolonged stressor that could gradually exhaust the reserves and resilience of complex states. The rejection of Thera as the primary cause does not diminish its historical importance. Rather, it sharpens our focus. It teaches us that when we investigate the fall of an age, we must look for a force that moves at the speed of the collapse itself, a force that can apply relentless pressure until the entire system buckles. A final piece of the puzzle may lie beneath our feet. While the climate crisis set the stage, some historians and archaeologists point to another layer of instability that could have delivered the final, shattering blows to societies already on the brink, a possible cluster of powerful earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits at a complex junction of tectonic plates, a region that has always been seismically active. There is intriguing, though debated, evidence from several archaeological sites dating to this era that suggests a period of unusually intense seismic activity. At the ruins of Mycenaean palaces and Levantine cities, excavators have sometimes found walls that appear to have collapsed outward in a manner consistent with seismic shaking, rather than being toppled inward by siege engines or deliberate demolition. The concept some researchers explore is that of an earthquake storm, a hypothesis where stress along a major fault line is not released in one large quake, but in a series of significant tremors rippling through the region over a span of decades. Imagine a civilization already reeling from famine, its grain stores nearly empty and its social order fraying. Then, the very ground it stands upon begins to shake. For communities whose identity and security were literally set in stone, in massive palace walls and fortified gates, such an event would be psychologically devastating. A major quake could destroy critical infrastructure in an instant, collapsing the last remaining storehouses, disrupting fragile water sources, and breaching defensive walls that were the final symbol of elite power. It would be a catastrophic multiplier of existing crises. A city struggling to feed itself now also has to find shelter for the displaced and clear rubble from its streets with a depleted and malnourished workforce. The key, however, is to see these potential earthquake storms not as a standalone cause, but as a brutal exacerbating factor. A healthy, prosperous society with full granaries and a confident population can often rebuild after a natural disaster. It is a setback but not a death sentence. A society already in the 5th year of a devastating drought, with its trade links severed and its people hungry, has no resilience left. An earthquake in that context is not just a disaster, it is the coup de grace. It transforms a slow, agonizing decline into a sudden, physical collapse. The trembling earth becomes the final argument against the old order, proving that even the gods of the palace and the cyclopean stones they built with could not protect them. This layered view of the collapse, with climate as the primary, slow-burning driver and events like seismic activity as acute triggers, feels tragically human. It reflects how real catastrophes often compound, where one vulnerability opens the door for the next. The story is no longer about a single villain, but about a perfect storm of misfortunes, where the foundations of both the earth and the society built upon it gave way at once. But a drought, however severe, does not directly topple a palace. It must first pass through the people who live within its walls and work its fields. The relentless climatic stress of those decades acted like a powerful X-ray, revealing the hidden fault lines that had always existed within these seemingly stable Bronze Age kingdoms. Beneath the glitter of gold and the grandeur of monumental architecture lay a fundamental tension, a deep-seated social contract that the drought would shatter. At the heart of this tension was a simple, brutal equation of survival. The palace redistributive economy functioned beautifully in times of plenty. Farmers would give a portion of their harvest to the central authority, and in return they received protection, access to crafted goods, and a share from the communal stores in lean years. It was a system built on trust and reciprocal benefit, but what happens when the lean years become the only years, when the harvests fail not for one season, but for 5 or 10? The palace granaries, those symbols of royal power and provision, would empty. The administrators and scribes who once meticulously recorded incoming taxes of grain would now be recording only deficits. In this desperate new reality, the social contract inverted. The peasant farmer, struggling to feed his own family from a withered field, is now asked to send his last handful of grain to a distant palace that can offer nothing in return. The palace, instead of being the solution, becomes the problem, a hungry mouth consuming the last scraps from the countryside. Historians suggest this likely sparked widespread resentment and ultimately open revolt. We can envision not a unified rebellion with banners and leaders, but 1,000 local refusals, a village elder deciding to hide the community's meager stores, a regional governor responsible for his own people's survival, withholding the annual tax shipment to the capital. This was a collapse of loyalty from the ground up. The elite palatial class, living behind their massive walls, became physically and symbolically isolated from the source of their wealth. Their legitimacy was based on their role as guarantors of order and abundance. When they could no longer fulfill that role, they were transformed from protectors into parasites in the eyes of the starving populace. This loss of faith extended beyond the king's court to the very spiritual foundations of society. In the ancient world, religion and kingship were inseparable. The pharaoh was a god on earth. The Hittite king was the chief priest of the storm god. Their primary duty was to maintain a harmonious relationship with the divine to ensure fertility and prosperity. When the rain stopped and the Nile ran low, it was not seen as a natural climate cycle. it was interpreted as a profound divine displeasure. The rituals, the sacrifices, the grand temples, all of it had failed. The institutions and theologies that explained the world and promised stability were suddenly bankrupt. Imagine the spiritual despair of a farmer praying to the storm god for rain year after year, only to watch the sky remain empty. His faith in the old gods, and by extension in the king who served as their intermediary, would have turned to dust as surely as his fields. This internal social and spiritual unraveling is the critical missing link. It explains how an environmental shock becomes a political collapse. A kingdom is not defeated when its borders are crossed. It is defeated when its own people no longer believe in its right to rule, when the soldier deserts his post to feed his family, when the farmer stops sending grain, and when the priest's prayers echo in a silent temple. The drought provided the pressure, but the deep cracks of inequality and conditional loyalty within these societies determined where and how they would break. The walls of Mycenae and Hattusa were ultimately breached not just by enemy forces, but by a vacuum of belief from within. The silence that followed the collapse was not empty, it was filled with stories. When a civilization shatters, its memory does not simply vanish. It fragments, transforms, and seeps into the bedrock of cultural identity. For the survivors and their descendants, the trauma of that loss demanded an explanation, a way to make sense of a world that had fallen from greatness into a simpler, harder existence. Over centuries, the raw historical truth of famine, migration, and fallen palaces was distilled into something more powerful: myth. The Greek world offers the clearest example. The people who emerged from the Dark Ages, the ancestors of classical Athens and Sparta, had no written records of their Mycenaean forebears. All they had were the colossal, ruined walls of places like Mycenae and Turin, structures so immense they seemed the work of giants, and the fragments of epic tales passed down orally for generations. From this raw material, they constructed a legendary past, the Age of Heroes. This was not a memory of bureaucratic palace accountants and grain shipments, but of mighty warriors, divine interventions, and a great, culminating war. The Trojan War cycle, immortalized by Homer centuries later, may be a profound cultural echo of the collapse. Think about its core elements: a coalition of Greek kings sailing across the sea to besiege a wealthy, fortified city in Anatolia. This narrative framework could easily preserve a blurred memory of the late Bronze Age world, a time when Mycenaean Greeks were actively engaged across the Aegean, when grand expeditions and the sacking of cities were part of the geopolitical landscape. The epic does not record an economic collapse, it records a glorious, tragic conflict that marked the end of an era. For the Greeks of the 8th century before the Common Era, listening to these poems, it explained why their world was not as grand as those stone ruins suggested. It told them they came from heroes and that a great cataclysm, a war to end all wars, had closed the door on that golden age. This transformation of historical trauma into foundational myth gave a broken past meaning and provided a shared origin story for a new Greece. Beyond the Aegean, another powerful motif resonates across Near Eastern cultures: the story of a great flood. From the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical book of Genesis, narratives of a world-destroying deluge sent by displeased gods are remarkably persistent. While these stories likely originate from various local river floods over millennia, their scale and their placement as a reset button for humanity could also carry the memory of a real civilization-ending catastrophe. The flood myth is not about a bad season, it is about an absolute cleansing, a near-total wipe of the slate from which only a fortunate few rebuild. This narrative structure mirrors the experience of the collapse, a universal disaster that seemed to come from the heavens, sparing only scattered remnants. It is a way for culture to process the incomprehensible, to frame a complex, decades-long ecological and social failure as a singular, divine event with a moral lesson. Perhaps the most compelling echo is found in the biblical story of Exodus. Scholarly debate places the possible origins of this narrative in the general timeframe of the late Bronze Age collapse. The story's core elements are striking: a group of people leaving a crumbling empire amidst signs of environmental chaos, wandering in the wilderness, and eventually forging a new identity and covenant. While not a direct record, Exodus encapsulates the essential experience of the era: the breakdown of a superpower, the plight of displaced populations on the move, and the profound search for a new order in the aftermath of systemic failure. The 10 plagues described in Exodus, including water turning to blood, pestilence on livestock, and darkness covering the land, read like a catalogue of ecological disasters, possibly reflecting folk memories of the drought, disease, and the atmospheric effects of distant volcanic eruptions that characterized the period. These stories were not history as we understand it, they were meaning-making. When the world you know ends, you must tell a story about why the gods were angry. Heroes fought and died, a covenant was broken and remade. These myths provided a framework to understand loss, to connect a diminished present to a grander past, and to instill lessons about hubris, piety, and resilience. They are the long shadow cast by the collapse, a testament to its deep psychological impact. The Bronze Age did not just leave behind ruins and silent tablets. It left an indelible mark on the human imagination, a haunting memory of a lost world that would shape the myths and identities of civilizations for millennia to come. The echoes of that ancient collapse resonate with a startling clarity in our modern world. The story of the Bronze Age is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a case study, a 3,000-year-old warning etched in tree rings and abandoned ruins. It demonstrates with brutal simplicity that no level of cultural achievement, technological sophistication, or political power can insulate a society from the failure of its ecological foundation. Those palaces were marvels of their age, yet they stood on a foundation of stable climate and predictable harvests. When that foundation cracked, the entire intricate structure came down. Today, we have built a civilization of staggering complexity and global interconnection, a network far more vast and intricate than the Bronze Age world could have conceived. Our supply chains stretch across the entire planet, our digital systems link continents in milliseconds, and our economies are deeply interdependent. This global system has brought unprecedented prosperity, but it has also created profound vulnerabilities, much like the tin trade routes of the late Bronze Age. Our modern version of that fragile supply chain might be energy, rare earth minerals, or global food production. The lesson of the past is that interdependence can become a vector for cascading failure when a systemic shock occurs. A drought in one breadbasket region, amplified by a changing climate, can ripple through financial markets, trigger political instability, and displace populations on a scale that would have been unimaginable to a Hittite king. The advanced technology that defines our era, from satellite agriculture to sophisticated weather modeling, offers powerful tools for adaptation and resilience. But the Bronze Age reminds us that technology is not a shield. The Mycenaeans had formidable engineering skills. They built walls that still awe us today, but those walls were useless against a changing sky. Our challenge is to ensure our technological and social innovations are directed toward strengthening our fundamental ecological supports, not just optimizing a system that remains fragile to the same kinds of long-term environmental stresses. The parallel is not one of direct equivalence but of structural similarity. We are not facing an identical mega-drought, but we are navigating a period of significant, human-accelerated climate change that stresses food systems, water resources, and social stability. The ancient collapse shows us that the greatest risk may not be the environmental event itself, but how that event interacts with the hidden fault lines in our societies, issues like inequality, resource distribution, and short-term political thinking. Their world did not end in a day. It unraveled over decades as leaders likely focused on immediate military threats while the true, slow-moving crisis starved them from within. Resilience, then, is not about building higher walls, but about fostering flexible, decentralized systems that can absorb shocks, whether through diversified food sources, robust social safety nets, or renewable energy grids that are less vulnerable to disruption. The silent stones of Hattusa and Mycenae ask us a sobering question: what are the true foundations of our own world, and how do we fortify them not just for the next economic quarter, but for the next generation? Their story is a humbling reminder that civilizations are not permanent. They are experiments in complexity, and their longevity depends ultimately on a sustainable partnership with the natural world that sustains them. Even the most compelling historical theories must acknowledge their own limits. While the evidence for a climate-driven collapse is now overwhelming, it does not provide a minute-by-minute transcript of the end. The tree rings tell us there was a devastating drought, and the ruins tell us societies fell, but the precise human moments that connected those two facts are often lost to us. We see the pressure and we see the breaking point, but the exact sequence of decisions, the failed policies, the final arguments in a crumbling palace, these remain in shadow. This gap is where the true detective work of history continues, as researchers strive to move from correlation to a clearer understanding of causation. The central unanswered question is one of local variation. The climate data paints a broad regional picture of aridification, but how did that play out in every valley and on every farm? We know the rains failed, but can we pinpoint exactly how a specific Mycenaean kingdom allocated its last stores of grain, or why one Hittite provincial governor chose to rebel while another remained loyal? The climate is the backdrop, but the drama was performed by individuals and institutions making choices under unimaginable stress. Historians and archaeologists are now combining their tools with climate science in increasingly sophisticated ways to close this gap. They are developing higher-resolution climate models that can suggest, for example, whether a particular spring in the Ugarit plain of Greece dried up a decade before a neighboring one, potentially explaining why one palace fell before another. They are meticulously studying settlement patterns, not just of grand capitals but of small villages, tracking the movement of populations in the decades leading up to the collapse. Did people begin to abandon the marginal highlands first, retreating toward the coasts or the few reliable water sources? This micro-level data can reveal the human response to the drought in real time, showing us the societal cracks as they formed. Another vibrant area of inquiry involves the interplay of climate with disease. Periods of famine and social disruption are often followed by outbreaks of illness, as malnutrition weakens populations and movement brings people into new contact with pathogens. While direct evidence is elusive from this distant period, some researchers speculate that epidemics may have been a silent partner in the collapse, a final blow to communities already weakened by hunger and conflict. Unraveling this possibility requires innovative science, such as analyzing ancient DNA from human remains to search for signs of widespread infection. Each of these research threads, from granular climate modeling to bioarchaeology, aims to add another piece to the puzzle, transforming the collapse from a monolithic event into a mosaic of countless local tragedies and adaptations. The search continues because the stakes of understanding are so high. This is not merely an academic exercise. By clarifying how these ancient societies responded, or failed to respond, to a prolonged environmental crisis, we gain invaluable insight into the dynamics of resilience itself. Every new discovery in a cave core or a scattered village site helps us see the collapse not as a foregone conclusion written in the weather, but as a complex process where human agency, for better or worse, ultimately determined the outcome. The past may never surrender all its secrets, but in the pursuit of those unanswered questions, we learn to ask better ones about our own future. The prevailing view that emerges today is not a story of a single villain, but of a cascade. Scholars now see the Bronze Age collapse as a textbook example of a complex system failure, where a primary environmental shock exposed and exploited every hidden vulnerability in a deeply interconnected world. The consensus points to a perfect storm, a convergence of crises where climate was the first and most decisive domino. Decades of relentless drought and aridification, etched into tree rings and cave stones, created an inescapable reality of scarcity. This was the primary driver, the slow-burning fuse that would ignite every other problem. When the rains failed across the eastern Mediterranean heartlands, the most immediate consequence was famine. Fields that had fed cities for generations turned to dust, and palace granaries, the strategic reserves of these complex states, were slowly emptied and could not be refilled. This agricultural collapse struck directly at the foundation of Bronze Age society. A king cannot command loyalty from starving subjects, and a scribe cannot record transactions when the flow of goods has ceased. The economic machinery, so dependent on agricultural surplus and long-distance trade for critical materials like tin, began to seize up. As the drought persisted, these internal pressures reached a breaking point. Social order frayed, with local communities likely hoarding what little food remained and turning against central authorities that could no longer provide. This internal fragmentation made the kingdoms vulnerable from within. It was this combination of famine and fractured loyalty that set the stage for the final, violent acts of the drama: mass migration and warfare. Desperate populations with nothing left to lose began to move. They became the displaced groups remembered as the Sea Peoples, not a unified army but a storm of human desperation spilling out from the collapsing interior. Their movements and attacks were not the cause of the collapse, but its most visible and destructive symptom. They were the spark that landed on kingdoms already soaked in the kindling of hunger and instability. The political and military crises that toppled palaces and burned cities were therefore the end result of a chain reaction that began with a changing sky. This represents a profound shift in how we understand history itself. For centuries, the collapse was explained through texts and archaeology alone, pointing to invasions or mysterious dark ages. Today, the explanation is fundamentally interdisciplinary. It weaves together the hard data of climate science with the traditional tools of the historian and archaeologist. The story is no longer just about kings and battles, but about tree rings, sediment cores, and atmospheric patterns. This synthesis gives us a more complete and more humbling picture. It shows that the mightiest empires were ultimately ecosystems, dependent on a delicate balance with their environment. When that balance was lost, the intricate political and cultural achievements they built upon it could not stand. The collapse was not a mystery of human failure alone, but a tragedy written at the intersection of nature and civilization. For over 3,000 years, the true story of the Bronze Age collapse remained buried, not just under layers of earth, but under layers of legend. The ruins themselves were never truly lost, their massive stones visible to every passing shepherd and traveler, but their meaning was a closed book. To the classical Greeks, Mycenae was the home of Agamemnon, a place from the Age of Heroes. To early archaeologists in the 19th century, digging into the ash layers of Troy or the palaces of Crete, the evidence suggested a dramatic, violent end, but the cause remained a matter of fierce debate. Was it a massive invasion, a social revolution? For most of the history of history, we could only interpret the silent stones with the tools we had, leading to narratives centered on human conflict alone. The breakthrough, the moment the mystery truly began to unravel, did not come from a single brilliant historian or a stunning new archaeological find. It came from a fundamental shift in how we investigate the past, a move from a human-centered story to an environmental one. The solution required looking beyond the clay tablets and shattered pottery to the natural world those societies lived within. This was the quiet revolution of paleoclimatology, beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating into the 21st. Scientists developed the remarkable techniques we have discussed, like reading the isotopic signatures in cave stalagmites and building millennia-long tree ring chronologies. For the first time, researchers could access a completely independent archive, one that recorded not the boasts of kings or the inventories of scribes, but the annual rainfall, the temperature shifts, and the growing conditions of the ancient world itself. This data did not replace archaeology or history, it transformed them. It provided a common timeline, a shared set of facts against which the human record could be compared. When the climate data from Anatolian junipers showed a catastrophic drought beginning around 1200 before the Common Era, historians could immediately cross-reference that with the last known Hittite tablets pleading for grain. When the speleothem records from the Levant showed a sharp drop in precipitation, archaeologists could see that the pattern of city abandonments in the region matched that climatic curve almost perfectly. This convergence of disciplines turned a collection of theories into a coherent explanation. The story of the Sea Peoples shifted from a cause to an effect. The collapse of trade was understood not as a random breakdown, but as the inevitable result of failing agricultural systems and social unrest. This collaborative, interdisciplinary approach is the hallmark of modern historical science. It acknowledges that civilizations do not exist in a vacuum. They are in constant dialogue with their environment. Solving the 3,000-year-old mystery required climatologists, dendrochronologists, geologists, archaeologists, and historians to all sit at the same table, sharing data and interpreting each other's findings. The result is a richer, more humbling, and ultimately more human story. We no longer see the people of the late Bronze Age as passive victims of a mysterious curse or a warlike horde. We see them as resilient communities facing a prolonged, unimaginable crisis, making difficult choices as their world slowly dried up around them. The collapse is no longer a dark age, but a comprehensible, if tragic, chapter in the long human relationship with a dynamic planet. This journey of discovery reminds us that the past is not static. It is constantly being rediscovered and reinterpreted through new lenses. Every scientific advancement offers a new key to an old lock, allowing us to hear the echoes of lost worlds with a little more clarity and to understand our own place within the long, interconnected story of humanity and the Earth. This final chapter of the Bronze Age forces us to reconsider a comforting story we often tell ourselves, the myth of linear progress. We like to imagine history as a steady climb, a ladder where each civilization builds upon the last, ascending toward greater complexity and control. The collapse shatters that illusion. Instead, it reveals civilizations as dynamic, living systems, more akin to a thriving forest than a stone monument. They grow, adapt, and flourish within a specific environmental niche, but they are never separate from it. Their greatest triumphs, the very things that make them feel permanent and powerful, are often what tether them most tightly to a particular set of conditions. The Mycenaean palaces were administrative marvels, but they required a constant surplus of grain. The Hittite Empire was a military juggernaut, but its strength depended on a steady flow of tin from across a continent. These were not flaws, they were features of their success. The palace redistributive economy created stability and wealth, allowing for specialization in art, architecture, and warfare. The international trade network fostered peace and cultural exchange. Yet in doing so, these systems wove a web of deep dependencies. When the climate, the silent partner in all human endeavor, shifted decisively, those dependencies transformed instantly into fatal vulnerabilities. The system that had once distributed abundance became a machine for amplifying scarcity. This is the core insight the collapse offers. A civilization's peak of achievement often coincides with its peak of fragility. The more complex and interconnected the system, the more points of potential failure it contains. A simple village might weather a drought by moving to a new spring or switching to a hardier crop. But a vast kingdom with its centralized grain stores, its specialized workforce, and its armies that need feeding and equipping has far less room to maneuver. Its very sophistication makes it rigid. The story of the Late Bronze Age is not one of primitive societies succumbing to a force they could not comprehend. It is the story of highly advanced societies being undone by the unintended consequences of their own brilliance, when the environmental context that nurtured that brilliance suddenly changed. This reframes our understanding of what it means for a civilization to end. It is not always a defeat in battle or a sudden cataclysm. It can be a slow uncoupling, a growing mismatch between the way a society is organized and the new realities of the world it inhabits. The people did not forget how to read Linear B because they became less intelligent. They stopped writing because the palace economy that required those records had ceased to function. The knowledge became obsolete. This perspective shifts the focus from heroes and invaders to systems and sustainability. It asks us to look at any civilization, past or present, and ask a simple but profound question: what are its non-negotiable inputs? What environmental constants does it absolutely depend upon, and how resilient is it to a change in those conditions? For the Bronze Age world, the non-negotiable input was a stable, predictable climate that delivered rain to specific regions at specific times. When that predictability vanished, the entire intricate social and economic architecture built upon it could not hold. Their legacy, therefore, is not just one of golden masks and cryptic scripts. It is a demonstration of a fundamental principle: that human history and natural history are not separate threads, but a single, intertwined story. To ignore one is to misunderstand the other completely. The silent stones of their ruins are not just memorials to a lost people. They are permanent questions etched into the landscape, challenging every society that comes after to consider the true foundations of its own grandeur. The ruins and the rings tell the same story. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age was not a mystery of war or invasion, but a tragedy of climate. The most advanced civilizations of their time, woven together by trade and diplomacy, were ultimately undone by a force they could never have anticipated: a sudden, severe, and prolonged shift in the very weather patterns that sustained them. Their interconnected prosperity, a marvel of the ancient world, became their greatest vulnerability when the skies dried up for decades. This was a systems collapse where the failure of harvests led to famine, which shattered social order, which severed critical trade routes, leaving each isolated kingdom starving, disarmed, and defenseless. The palaces did not fall to a more powerful enemy. They were starved into silence by a changing world. This story rewrites our understanding of history itself, moving it from the realm of kings and battles to the fundamental relationship between human societies and their environment. The legacy of these lost civilizations is a powerful case study in resilience and fragility, a 3,000-year-old reminder that no amount of cultural or technological achievement can insulate a civilization from the failure of its ecological foundations. Their world reminds us that our own globalized age, for all its differences, faces similar questions of interdependence and environmental vulnerability. If you found this journey into the deep past compelling, consider exploring further. Many brilliant books and documentaries delve into the archaeology and climate science of this period, and I encourage you to share your own thoughts or questions in the comments below. The conversation about our past is, in many ways, a conversation about our future.